I'm going to be looking at one of my favourite areas of Jung's work, and that is the dreams and the unconscious.
Every day is a struggle. Every day is a trial.
So what's on the agenda today? Well, we're going to be looking at who was Jung, historical context, Jung's training, the psyche, the conscious and unconscious mind, Jungian techniques to explore in the therapy room, 2 clients of Jung, and we'll do a little critique of Jung to round off the session. Jung was a Swiss psychologist and psychoanalyst who founded analytical psychology. He was born in Kessville, Switzerland in 1875, and he died in 1961. As a student, Jung attended the University of Basel, where he studied psychiatry and medicine. Jung became an incredible scholar, fascinated with a range of topics such as astrology, Gnosticism, psychology, alchemy, and world religions. For Jung, a person's spiritual life was incredibly important to the healing process. Therefore, in later life, he became dedicated to exploring his own inner world through dreams and the unconscious. What was happening during Jung's life? Towards the end of the 19th century, Charles Darwin's theory of evolution challenged all religious thinking. Science was beginning to prove that we'd evolved from an ape-like species, which unsettled the traditional views of the time and caused people to question the Bible. Sigmund Freud, an Austrian neurologist and the founder of psychoanalysis, was also making waves. Freud wrote theories about the unconscious in human psychology with the aim to expand people's minds. Overall, there was a newfound hunger for exploring the psyche and self-knowledge. What about Jung's training? Now, this is really interesting because he was such a radical for his time. Most psychiatrists of the time were not totally interested in what patients had to say. They were more interested in statistics and making a diagnosis. You could say that they were sacrificing the journey that was supposed to be embarked upon between therapist and client. They were sacrificing that for the end goal. This displeased Jung, and this is when he began to get interested in Freud's work. Freud was interested in hysteria, dreams, and looking at each patient as an individual with a unique personality and problems. He also stressed that a patient's problem was never the symptom alone. It was the whole person. Therefore, we must ask questions to challenge the whole personality. Jung believed that every patient came to therapy with an untold story. And it's this secret story that is the key to knowing the remedy for the treatment. However, the remedy can't be accessed purely through the conscious mind. We must delve into the patient's unconscious.
This life doesn't go well with me. I'm not a member of the band.
This brings us to the psyche. So the psyche means breath or life or soul. It's a Greek word. You know, the whole of the mind, the spirit, the conscious and the unconscious. Jung describes the psyche as a process rather than an object. He also notes that it's constantly changing, seeking growth and wholeness. And ultimately, the psyche's main goal is to move towards our most authentic self. Jung saw our minds as divided into separate parts: the conscious mind, the unconscious mind, and then the collective unconscious. Now, the conscious mind is unique to the individual. It organizes perception, thoughts, and feelings. Our conscious mind controls what we're doing in the present moment. You know, it's central to consciousness is our ego, which gives us a strong sense of identity and purpose. Then we have our unconscious. Now, this is a vessel for repressed traumas, forgotten memories, and experiences of anything that could be perceived as threatening or destabilizing to the ego. And you may have experienced this, but our unconscious expresses itself through dreams, through slips of the tongue, and fantasies. What's most interesting here is that Jung felt if the unconscious wasn't acknowledged, or if it was ignored, the consequences could be detrimental. It could manifest in a physical illness or madness. Then we have the collective unconscious. Now, this is the most interesting part of the human mind for me. The collective unconscious is symbols, archetypes, innate knowledge that is known to the whole of the human race. Archetypes are psychic patterns repeated throughout history and myth. And some common versions of archetypes are things like the father archetype, the mother archetype, the divine child archetype. And we see these archetypes play out in the tarot, in the major arcana as well. And Jung was particularly interested in tarot. He could see the benefit of exploring the tarot and using the tarot, potentially with patients, to reflect or find something within themselves and unpack it. So what's the point of all this? Well, as with any therapy, it's about integration. It's about acknowledging the trauma so you can move through the trauma. Jung thought that if we encouraged the patient's more negative complex to surface, that they could be examined and changed, and therefore the patient would be able to release themselves or free themselves from these negative patterns of behaviour and stop acting from such a negatively charged place. What is generally considered Psychology 101 now, the fact that you have to acknowledge the repressed traumas to move through them, this was some of Jung's earliest thinking.
No one knows where the life force flows.
Let's look at some Jungian techniques to use in the therapy room. All these techniques that I'm about to list are supposed to help the client bridge the conscious and unconscious mind and integrate them. These activities require the client to surrender to fantasy while also maintaining an active imagination and a conscious point of view. First off, we have the famous association test, and you probably know what this is. So Jung would usually say a word, and then he'd ask the patient to make an association with that word pretty much immediately, and they'd examine kind of the links and the associations, why these associations were made, and see if it revealed anything about the unconscious. So for example, let's try it right now. What word comes to mind when I say fire? Note down that word. What about joy? Again, what's the first word that comes to mind? Really feel it. What about death? What words are evoked with death? And then lastly, to end on a good note, rebirth. What words do you associate with rebirth? Leave the comments below. I'd love to know what came up for you. Then we have a dream interpretation. So Jung would ask his clients to relate a dream to him, and they'd kind of co-interpret them together. Some questions he might ask would be, what does this symbol mean to you in this moment? Is this a reoccurring image? How does it make you feel? Is this a reoccurring dream? And what's particularly important is context. What was happening in the patient's life at the time they had the dream. I'd encourage you to think about your own dreams, maybe even create a dream journal. I know from my personal experience that a dream journal has been incredibly enlightening for me. The most bizarre dreams have revealed the most truthful, profound things about my unconscious and really helped me navigate my own life path. Another Jungian technique is active imagination. And when I say Jungian technique, okay, he kind of gave it a name, but actually there are so many cultures, ancient cultures, that were practicing these sorts of things way before Jung started using them in the therapy room. So active imagination is achieved by getting your client into a hypnagogic state. So hypnagogia is the state between wakefulness and sleep. And when you're in a hypnagogic state, you might be aware that you're dreaming. And you might be aware of like sensations in the body, maybe like a tingling in your palm, maybe a tingling in your third eye. Things come up in the body when you're in this sort of hypnagogic state. Similar concepts to active imagination are things like shamanic journeying or yoga nidra, and different types of meditation that really encourage you to kind of let the unconscious mind surface. But while in this hypnagogic state, Jung said it simply wasn't enough to just kind of like watch these images play out, but you actually must interact with them. Now that might seem a bit bizarre to some of you, and that's totally okay. But yes, I can say from personal experience, I've done shamanic journeying workshops, and there have been these moments where I've interacted with certain symbols or beings in the dream, and answers are revealed, or you're shown more if you ask, or if you know how to ask the right question. And it's really quite amazing. What I found most fascinating about these Jungian techniques is he was really aware that whatever his patient was experiencing, he needed to be almost like doubly aware of his own unconscious at the time. You know, how am I experiencing this patient's dream? What is coming up for me? How am I feeling this in my own body? And he thought that if the therapist failed to kind of keep tabs on both the unconscious of his patient and the unconscious of himself, this could be, again, detrimental. A little bit of information as well, which I would like to just elevate. Jung said that every therapist should have somebody to confess to. And he said that women were particularly good listeners and had excellent intuition. So there you go. Jung, he knew what he was talking about.
No one knows where the next wind blows.
I'm wondering whether it would be useful to look at some of Jung's cases. So there was one in particular that struck me, and this was a woman who came to Jung. She was just a one-off client. She was upper class, and she claimed she used to be a doctor. She admitted that she had actually murdered her best friend to be with her best friend's husband. Yes, she'd committed the murder out of jealousy, and she felt that for some reason, if nobody discovered the murder, then that she wouldn't be affected. Not so. So when she married the best friend's husband, he died relatively soon after. She was also a keen horse rider, but after she murdered her best friend, the horses actually were afraid of her and threw her off, so she had to give that up. Also, her daughter from that marriage, as soon as she was old enough, left and estranged herself from her mother. And then last but not least, one of her dogs her only dog got paralysis. So yeah, she felt as though she had been punished. By God knows what, but she felt as though she was being punished and that she needed to confess to someone who would not judge her, and that's what brought her to Jung. So there could be one or two things going on here, or maybe it's both. So were all these events actually related to the fact that she murdered her best friend? Is Jung, by including this story in one of his case histories, is he, implying that our unconscious is sending out a signal to like animals and our family that we've kind of done something bad? Does this kind of like send out a bad energy? Was this murderess's unconscious stricken with guilt, and did her mind somehow create a narrative wherein she was being punished? I don't know, what do you think? But I absolutely adore this quote, one who commits a crime destroys his own soul. Patient 2 was a long-term client of Jung's, and he suffered from depression. Now, this relates to the phenomenon of synchronicity. The story I'm about to unfold is related to this phenomenon. Synchronicity refers to something that is kind of a simultaneous occurrence of events which appear significantly related, but have no seemingly causal connection. A small example would be like when you're thinking of a friend, you've not spoken to them in a while, and then the next minute they're calling you on the phone. That is a synchronicity. So the story goes, Jung managed to pull this patient out of depression, but after a year or so, he plunged right back into it. One night, Jung was giving a talk away from home, and he returned to the hotel, went to sleep, and then around about 2 a.m, he suddenly woke up and he felt as though someone had burst through the doors and entered his hotel room. And he felt this horrible pain in the back of his head. And he thought, that's weird, went back to sleep. Then the next morning, he received a telegram that his patient the depressive patient had committed suicide, and he'd shot himself and the bullet had come out of the back of his brain. So yeah, this was something that astonished Jung. So Jung had this aim that, we're supposed to balance the conscious and unconscious mind. And I love this quote here, there's some people, whether we care to admit it or not, can tolerate the loss of myth. They cannot find fulfillment in a purely exterior world as it's portrayed by science and rational materialism. They're also not satisfied with intellectual juggling of words, which has nothing whatsoever to do with wisdom. I am one of those people. I am not satisfied with scientific, rational materialism, like science to an extent, but please, can we please merge science and spirituality? Like that would just be amazing, please. Jung felt that if our conscious and unconscious mind were out of balance, we could develop neuroses. For example, if we're too consciously invested in seeking status, reputation, outward success or money, while lacking any sort of spiritual sustenance, which could be developed by integrating the unconscious mind, well, if we don't do that, then we'll feel confined. No matter how much money we make, we'll feel confined, remain unfulfilled and neurotic, even when we've attained those materialistic things. However, if we are imaginative enough to develop a rich inner life filled with spiritual and symbolic meaning, we have the power to heal ourselves. He said neuroses forms when we divide against ourselves, so when we're not being true to ourselves. And if we still lived in a time where humans respected myth and the world of our ancestors, then we wouldn't separate from ourselves and the world would be spared this sort of split or this division. Some final critiques of Jung. So, Jung was racist. He said that black people got under the skin of white person, that black people wanted to become white people, which is obviously not true. There's a racial complex going on here. That's so much bigger than this oversimplified statement. However, saying that, part of our collective shadow as a society is that racism is systemic, and it would be beneficial for us to look at this collective shadow using Jung's theories. Anti-Semitism is something that also comes up in Jung's stories. Some have accused him of anti-Semitism, but I encourage you to go and look up that story yourself and decide. Too often, Jung is dismissed as unscientific, mystic obsessed, and placing too much importance on dreams and symbols. Jung was for women's rights. However, he did that thing where therapists, say if you've got a female patient, they would schedule the appointment with the husband rather than the female patient themselves. But that was quite common for the time. However, he acknowledges in his autobiography that women often entered into his work with extraordinary conscientiousness, understanding and intelligence. And it was essentially because of these women that he was able to strike out new paths in therapy, which I think is bloody cool. So finally, I just wanted to leave you with this thought. There is no coming to consciousness without pain. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own soul. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. That is everything. Well, it's not everything, because Jung's work is just like ridiculous. There's so much of it, but this was kind of the bit that fascinated me most, so I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to get your hands on this deck, head to my Patreon, drop a like on the video, drop a comment below, and again, just thank you for watching. I appreciate all your support, so amazing. I'll see you next time.